Man looked at the German shepherd and her puppies. Then suddenly, he saw a hand reach out. The road to Redwood National Park stretched endlessly before Jonah Graham, the towering redwoods standing like silent sentinels against the backdrop of the mist-laden sky. The rhythmic hum of his car's engine was the only sound in the cabin, his fingers gripping the steering wheel just a little too tightly. He hadn't spoken much since leaving the city, not that there had been anyone to talk to. This trip wasn't about sightseeing or adventure. It was about escape. After months of drowning in the weight of his grief, he needed space to breathe, to let the vastness of nature dull the ache that clung to him like a second skin. The loss of his father had left a hollow in his chest, and despite everything, friends checking in, the condolences, the promises that time would heal, Jonah still felt lost. The world moved on, and he wasn't sure he knew how to do the same. He pulled into the small, rustic cabin he had rented for the week, its wooden walls nestled against the towering redwoods like a forgotten relic of time. It was simple, just as he wanted. A bed, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchenette. No distractions, no reminders of what he had left behind. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, wrapping around him like an old embrace as he stepped outside. The towering trees whispered with the wind, their voices ancient and knowing. Jonah closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to let the stillness settle inside him. But peace never came easily. The next morning he set out early, backpack slung over his shoulder, boots crunching against the leaf-littered forest floor. The redwoods loomed overhead, their sheer size making him feel insignificant in the best way possible. He had always loved the quiet of the wilderness, how it swallowed the noise of the world, leaving only the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the rhythmic cadence of his own breathing. As he ventured deeper, the trail thinned, winding through moss-covered trunks and ferns that curled toward the dappled light. He wasn't following a map, just letting instinct guide him. It was by accident that he found her. The low whimper reached him first, barely audible over the hush of the forest. Jonah stopped, heart pounding. He scanned the area, stepping cautiously toward the sound. There, half hidden beneath a fallen tree, was a German shepherd, her ribs stark against her matted fur. Her amber eyes locked onto his, a mixture of fear and exhaustion clouding them. Around her, nestled against the damp earth, were 5 tiny puppies, their small bodies shivering despite the weak sunlight filtering through the canopy. Jonah knelt, his movements slow. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice softer than he had heard it in months. The mother dog tensed but didn't growl, just watched him with wary eyes. She looked exhausted, too weak to stand. Her puppies whimpered, tiny legs twitching as they huddled close to her warmth. Jonah's chest tightened. How long had they been out here? He reached into his backpack, pulling out the sandwich he had packed for lunch. Tearing off a small piece, he placed it on the ground near her. She sniffed it hesitantly before licking it up with slow, deliberate movements. That was a good sign. "You've been through a lot, huh?" he whispered, watching as she nudged one of her pups closer. His mind raced. He couldn't just leave them here. The mother, he decided to call her Freya, was dangerously thin, and her pups were too young to survive without help. Swallowing hard, Jonah shrugged off his jacket and laid it on the ground. One by one, he gently lifted the puppies onto the fabric, their tiny bodies squirming in protest. Freya tensed, but when Jonah met her eyes, she seemed to understand. With a shuddering breath, she pushed herself up, staggering toward him. Jonah's heart clenched as he carefully wrapped them in his jacket and lifted them into his arms. The walk back was slow, each step deliberate, as he tried not to jostle the fragile cargo against his chest. Freya walked beside him, her pace sluggish but determined. When they finally reached the cabin, Jonah pushed the door open and lowered the bundle onto the thick rug near the fireplace. He quickly set to work, filling a bowl with water, scouring the cabinets for anything edible. Freya drank eagerly, her tail giving the smallest wag. It was the first sign of trust, and Jonah felt something inside him shift. As the fire crackled to life, warmth seeped into the small space, chasing away the lingering cold. The puppies, now nestled against a folded blanket, let out tiny, contented sighs. Jonah sat beside them, watching as Freya curled protectively around her litter. He reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers over her fur. She let out a quiet huff but didn't pull away. That night, sleep came easier than it had in months. The steady rise and fall of Freya's breath, the soft whimpers of the puppies, it was a quiet kind of comfort, one that settled deep in his bones. But something still lingered at the edge of his mind, an unease that had nothing to do with the fragile family now sharing his space. It wasn't until the next morning that he understood why. Stepping outside, Jonah stretched, the cool air waking him up more than the weak coffee in his hand. His boots crunched against the damp earth as he wandered back toward the spot where he had found Freya, curiosity tugging at him. The forest felt different today, heavier, as if holding its breath. He traced his steps, moving past moss-covered roots and ferns that trembled under the weight of morning dew. Then he saw it. Partially buried beneath tangled roots and layers of earth was a massive stone hand. Fingers curled slightly, as if frozen in the act of reaching for something just beyond its grasp. The surface was weathered, covered in intricate carvings that had been worn smooth by time. Jonah's breath caught as he stepped closer, brushing away the loose dirt. His fingers traced the patterns, swirls that seemed to mimic the rings of the towering redwoods, ancient symbols he didn't recognize. A strange warmth pulsed beneath his fingertips. He jerked his hand back, heart hammering. It was just stone. Just another relic lost to time, another mystery swallowed by the forest. But as he stood there staring at the hand that seemed almost alive, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that finding Freya and her pups, wasn't a coincidence. Something was waiting to be uncovered. And for the first time in a long while, Jonah wasn't sure he was afraid of what that meant. Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him. The stone hand, half buried and ancient, loomed over his thoughts as he trudged back to the cabin, the weight of what he had found pressing against his chest like an unspoken question. Freya greeted him at the door, her amber eyes tracking his every movement, tail flicking once in quiet acknowledgement. The puppies were still curled in the blanket near the fire, their tiny bodies twitching in sleep, safe and warm for the first time in who knew how long. Jonah knelt beside them, fingers ghosting over their soft fur. He had promised himself this trip was just for solitude, a brief escape from the heaviness of the world he had left behind. But now it seemed like the forest had other plans for him. He spent the morning tending to Freya, watching her eat in slow, careful bites, as if she didn't quite believe the food would always be there. He spoke to her in quiet murmurs, telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud in months. How the silence after his father's death had swallowed him whole. How he had spent too long pretending he was fine. Freya listened, tilting her head in that knowing way dogs had, as if she understood everything. When the puppies stirred, their tiny squeaks filling the cabin, Jonah couldn't help but smile. It had been too long since his life had felt anything but empty. By midday, he found himself back in town, standing in the small library, its dust-filled air thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten stories. He hadn't come looking for anything in particular, but the memory of the carvings on the stone hand tugged at him. An older woman at the front desk raised an eyebrow as he approached, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor. "Help you find something?" she asked, adjusting her reading glasses. Jonah hesitated before finally speaking. "I'm looking for anything on Redwood National Park's history. Old records, maybe indigenous legends?" The librarian's expression shifted slightly, her fingers tapping against the counter. "That's a broad request. Any reason in particular?" Jonah considered lying, but something in the weight of the woman's gaze told him she'd see right through it. "I found something in the wood," he admitted. "A carving. Part of a statue, I think." He expected skepticism, maybe dismissal, but instead the librarian hummed thoughtfully. "You should talk to Elias Hawthorne," she said, scribbling a name onto a notepad. "He's a historian, used to work with the conservation department before he retired. Knows more about the park than anyone." She handed him the note, lips pressed into a firm line. "But be careful. If it's what I think it is, some things in those woods are better left undisturbed." Jonah didn't have a chance to ask what she meant before she turned back to her book, the conversation apparently over. He glanced down at the paper in his hand. Elias Hawthorne. It was a place to start. The man's house was a short drive from town, tucked at the edge of the forest, its wooden frame weathered by time and the elements. Jonah hesitated only briefly before knocking on the door. A long silence stretched between them before it creaked open, revealing an older man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a beard that was more silver than black. "Not many people come knocking around here," Elias said, his voice rough with age but not unkind. "You lost?" Jonah shook his head. "I was told you know about the history of the park. I found something. A stone hand. It's massive, covered in carvings. Looks like it's been buried for a long time." Elias stiffened, something flickering across his face before he stepped aside, motioning Jonah inside. The house was cluttered, every available surface covered in books, maps, and scattered papers, the walls lined with old photographs of the redwoods in every season. "You're not the first to find a piece of it," Elias muttered, sinking into a chair by the fireplace. "That statue, it's older than this town, older than the park itself. Some say it's the remains of a guardian, a protector of the forest." Jonah frowned, his mind flashing back to the warmth he had felt when touching the stone. "A guardian?" Elias nodded. "The local tribes have stories about it, a being that once stood watch over the land, ensuring the balance between nature and man. But something happened. No one knows exactly what. The pieces of the statue were scattered, and over time the forest buried it, hid it away." He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You said you found the hand?" Jonah nodded. "Partially buried. It felt warm." That seemed to catch Elias off guard. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. "The legend says that when the guardian is whole, the forest flourishes, but when it is broken, the land suffers. Most people think it's just a story, but if you felt something, then maybe, just maybe, there's more to it than myth." Jonah let the words settle in his chest. He had come here to escape, to lose himself in the quiet of the woods, not to unearth forgotten legends. And yet he couldn't ignore the pull deep in his gut, the feeling that he had stumbled upon something bigger than himself. Elias sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "If you're serious about this, you'll need help. The statue isn't just lying around waiting to be put back together. It's in pieces, hidden by time, and finding them won't be easy." Jonah thought of Freya and her puppies, of the way he had found them, helpless and abandoned, waiting for someone to care. Maybe this was the same. Maybe some things, no matter how lost, were meant to be found again. The next morning, Jonah returned to the site, Freya trotting at his side, her strength slowly returning. The stone hand remained as he had left it, half buried beneath the earth, its carvings whispering secrets of a time long past. He crouched beside it, fingers tracing the patterns once more. "You ready for this?" he murmured to Freya, though the question felt as much for himself as for her. The dog only wagged her tail. Jonah exhaled and began to dig. The soil was damp beneath Jonah's fingers, the rich scent of earth mixing with the crisp morning air as he dug, his breath steady, deliberate. Freya sat beside him, her ears twitching at the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of unseen birds breaking the silence. The hand was larger than he had initially thought, its stone fingers stretching deeper into the ground, as if it had been grasping at something long buried. He worked carefully, brushing away layers of dirt, revealing more of the intricate carvings that covered its surface, swirling patterns that mimicked the rings of redwoods, delicate etchings of animals woven into the stone. The warmth was still there, faint but unmistakable, pulsing beneath his fingertips like something alive. He lost track of time, his world narrowing to the rhythmic scrape of his hands against the earth, the slow unveiling of the forgotten artifact. When he finally sat back, the morning had drifted into early afternoon, sunlight filtering through the canopy above in golden streaks. The hand was more exposed now, its wrist tapering into a jagged break, where it had once connected to something larger. Jonah ran a hand over his face, wiping away sweat and dirt, his mind whirling with questions. What had this statue once been? Who had carved it? And why had it been left to sink into the forest floor, forgotten by time? A low whimper pulled him from his thoughts. Freya nudged his arm, her amber eyes flicking toward the trees. Jonah followed her gaze, the hair on the back of his neck prickling as he realized how quiet the forest had become. No wind rustling the leaves, no distant calls of birds or scurrying of small animals. Just stillness, heavy and expectant. He exhaled slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans as he stood. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to Freya. "Let's see how deep this goes." It wasn't long before he realized he needed help. He had uncovered a large portion of the hand, but without tools he couldn't go much further. The thought of bringing someone else into this, of sharing what he had found, left an uneasy weight in his chest. He had spent so much time avoiding people, retreating from conversations and well-meaning condolences, preferring the quiet isolation of his grief. But this was bigger than him. He needed someone who knew more, who could make sense of the carvings and the strange warmth that lingered beneath his touch. By the time he returned to town, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. He found himself standing outside Elias Hawthorne's home once more, the older man answering the door with a raised brow and a knowing look, as if he had expected Jonah to return. "You found something else," Elias said, stepping aside without waiting for a response. Jonah entered, the scent of old books and pipe smoke filling the air as he sank into the worn armchair across from the fireplace. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need help," he admitted, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "The hand. It's part of something much bigger, but I can't uncover it alone." Elias studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I figured as much." He pushed himself up from his chair, crossing the room to pull a large leather-bound book from the shelf. He set it on the table between them, flipping through pages filled with faded sketches and handwritten notes. "This is the closest thing we have to a record of what you found," he said, tapping a page depicting a massive stone figure, its arms outstretched, its face carved with the same swirling patterns Jonah had seen on the hand. "The sentinel of the redwoods. It was said to stand at the heart of the forest, a guardian of the land. No one knows exactly what happened to it, but over time, it was lost, broken into pieces, scattered." Jonah traced the illustration with his fingers, his mind racing. "Do you think we can find the rest?" Elias sighed, leaning back with a thoughtful expression. "That depends. Some believe the pieces were deliberately hidden, buried by time and the land itself. If that's true, it won't be easy." He closed the book, looking Jonah in the eye. "But if you're serious about this, I'll help you." They set out the next morning, armed with shovels, ropes, and enough supplies to last the day. Elias led the way through the dense undergrowth, his steps sure despite his age. He moved like someone who knew these woods well, pausing every so often to examine the terrain, his sharp gaze scanning the ground for any signs of disturbance. Jonah followed closely, Freya trotting between them, her ears pricked with quiet curiosity. It took hours of careful searching before they found something. Near a fallen redwood, half buried beneath layers of moss and dirt, another piece of stone jutted from the ground. It was smoother than the hand, curving slightly, a shoulder perhaps, or part of a torso. Jonah's pulse quickened as he crouched beside it, running his fingers over the cool surface. The same intricate carvings decorated the stone, patterns weaving together like an unbroken story waiting to be read. Elias let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You might actually be onto something." They worked in tandem, clearing away the dirt, revealing more of the massive fragment. Every so often, Jonah would glance at Freya, who sat watching with an intensity that unsettled him. It was as if she understood the significance of what they were doing, her gaze never wavering from the stone. When they had uncovered enough to confirm the piece's size, they stepped back, both men breathing heavily from the effort. "This isn't just some lost relic," Elias said finally, his voice quieter than before. "It's a part of something ancient, something the land itself has been guarding." Jonah wiped the sweat from his brow, staring at the fragment with a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had come here looking for peace, for an escape from the weight of his grief. But the forest had given him something else entirely: purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in a deep golden glow, Jonah felt it again. The warmth beneath his fingertips, the pulse of something long forgotten, stirring just beneath the surface. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't afraid. The rhythmic scrape of metal against soil filled the stillness of the forest as Jonah and Elias dug, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Hours had passed since they uncovered the stone torso, their bodies aching from the effort, yet neither of them spoke of stopping. Freya sat a few feet away, her amber eyes never straying from the unearthed fragment, her ears flicking at every shift in the wind, as if she, too, was waiting for something. The deeper they dug, the more the carvings revealed themselves. Intricate spirals, depictions of animals woven into the stone surface, like ancient stories whispered through time. Jonah's fingers traced a figure etched near the center. Fingers traced a figure etched near the center. A massive tree standing tall between two outstretched hands, its branches curling upward into the shape of a rising sun. He exhaled slowly, brushing dirt from the lines, a quiet reverence settling over him. This wasn't just a statue. It was a story, a piece of something lost yet still alive beneath the soil. Elias straightened, rubbing his lower back, his breath coming in heavy pants. If I had known retirement would lead to digging up ancient statues, I'd have kept my damn office job, he muttered, though there was no real irritation in his tone. Jonah smirked, leaning on his shovel, exhaustion tugging at his limbs, but failing to dull the quiet thrill coursing through him. "You're the one who said you wanted to help," he reminded, nudging the older man with his elbow. Elias snorted. "Help, yes. Manual labor? Questionable." He stepped back, studying their progress, his gaze lingering on the carvings. "You feel it too, don't you?" he murmured. Jonah didn't need to ask what he meant. He did feel it, the same pulse of warmth, the same unshakable certainty that the forest was watching, waiting. The sun had dipped lower, streaking the sky with gold and crimson when they decided to pause, exhaustion winning over curiosity for the time being. Jonah sat beside Freya, scratching behind her ears, the rhythmic motion grounding him. She leaned into him, her body warm against his side, a quiet reassurance in the way she stayed close. He had found her in this forest, had seen the desperation in her eyes, and yet she had survived. She had fought to keep her puppies alive. That resilience, that instinct to protect, it mirrored something in the statue, something in the land itself. Back at the cabin, the scent of firewood and damp fur filled the air as Jonah set out food for Freya and her pups, watching as they eagerly nuzzled against her, their tiny bodies growing stronger each day. It was strange how quickly his world had shifted, how these fragile creatures had become an anchor, grounding him in a way nothing else had since his father's death. He sat by the fire, fingers brushing over his phone screen, debating. He could call someone, contact a museum, reach out to a research institute. But something held him back. This felt personal, like a secret not meant to be handed over to strangers who would treat it like just another historical curiosity. Elias arrived the next morning, a thick book in hand, the spine cracked from years of use. He set it down on the cabin's small wooden table, flipping through pages filled with sketches of artifacts, notes scribbled in the margins in faded ink. "This," he said, tapping a page, "might be what we're looking for." Jonah leaned over, scanning the illustration, a full depiction of the sentinel of the redwoods, its form massive, arms spread as if cradling the very sky. The notes beside it detailed old accounts from settlers and indigenous tribes, each story different but carrying the same theme. A protector, a guardian that had once stood tall among the trees before vanishing into legend. "Do you think it was destroyed on purpose?" Jonah asked, his fingers absently tracing the book's worn edges. Elias exhaled, his gaze distant. "Possibly, or maybe time simply took its toll. Either way, the forest decided to bury it." He glanced at Jonah then, a knowing look in his eyes. "And yet, it let you find it." Jonah swallowed, shifting in his seat. He didn't believe in fate, but he couldn't deny the weight of that statement, the way it settled into his bones like truth. They spent the day mapping out the possible locations of the missing pieces, using old survey maps and geological records to pinpoint areas where shifts in the land might have hidden the fragments. It was slow, tedious work, but it gave Jonah a sense of purpose, a direction. He wasn't just wandering anymore, wasn't running from his grief. He was moving towards something, piecing together a history long forgotten. As evening fell, Jonah stepped outside, the crisp night air biting against his skin. The forest stretched before him, endless and unknowable. Yet for the first time, it didn't feel so empty. He turned his gaze upward, the sky littered with stars, the faint glow of the moon casting shadows through the towering redwoods. Freya padded up beside him, pressing her head against his palm, grounding him in the present. He looked down at her, at the trust in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning air was cool and damp, the scent of wet earth lingering as Jonah stood at the excavation site, hands resting on his hips. The past few days had been a blur of digging, of uncovering more pieces of the statue, each fragment revealing more of the Sentinel's lost story. The torso had been the hardest to unearth, its weight massive, its carvings deeper than the others, as if time itself had struggled to wear them away. Freya watched him from a patch of sunlight, her puppies nestled together in the grass, their small bodies rising and falling in soft, steady breaths. Jonah let out a slow exhale, wiping sweat from his brow as he turned to Elias, who stood beside him, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the statue's exposed form. "We're close," Jonah murmured, the words more for himself than anyone else. Elias nodded, his usual skepticism giving way to something almost reverent. "Closer than anyone's ever been," he admitted, voice quiet. They worked in silence, the scrape of shovels and the occasional snap of roots, the only sounds cutting through the forest stillness. Hours passed, the sun rising higher, warming the damp chill that had settled in the air. Jonah's muscles ached, exhaustion creeping into his bones. But he kept going, kept brushing away the layers of earth that had hidden the Sentinel's remains for centuries. Finally, as the light shifted into afternoon, they uncovered the last piece, a head partially broken but unmistakably carved, its stone eyes hollow yet piercing, as if it had been watching, waiting. Jonah ran his fingers over the worn surface, a shiver rolling down his spine. The warmth was back, thrumming beneath his fingertips, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He swallowed hard, glancing at Elias, who looked just as affected. They spent the rest of the day arranging the pieces, using what they could to lift the heavier fragments, aligning them as best as possible. It was crude, temporary, but for the first time in generations, the Sentinel stood again, incomplete yet undeniably powerful. Jonah stepped back, chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths, staring at what they had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a restoration, a remembrance. He felt Freya press against his leg, her warmth grounding him as the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing what had been returned. The wind shifted suddenly, a low rustling sweeping through the trees, sending leaves spiraling into the air. The warmth beneath Jonah's skin deepened, spreading through his limbs, wrapping around his chest. It wasn't just heat, it was something else, something alive. He heard Elias inhale sharply beside him, the old man's eyes wide, reflecting the same astonishment Jonah felt creeping through his veins. The Sentinel wasn't just stone, it never had been. The air grew thick, charged, the energy pulsing through the ground, radiating from the statue itself. Jonah staggered back, gripping Freya's fur as she let out a soft, low whine. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sensation faded, dissipating into the air like mist in the morning sun. Silence followed, heavier than before. Elias let out a shaky breath, dragging a hand over his face. "I don't know what the hell just happened," he muttered, "but I felt it." Jonah nodded, his heart still racing. "Me too." For a long time they stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle. Jonah didn't know what this meant, if the Sentinel had been restored in some spiritual way, or if it was merely a relic granted temporary recognition by the forest itself. But what he did know was that something had shifted, in him, in the land, in everything. He turned to Freya, dropping to his knees, pressing his forehead against hers. "We did it," he whispered, voice thick. "We really did it." That evening, back at the cabin, Jonah sat by the fire. Freya curled at his feet, the puppies nestled in a woven basket beside him. Elias had gone home, muttering something about needing a drink strong enough to make sense of the past few days. Jonah had simply nodded, too tired to argue, too overwhelmed to do anything but sit in the quiet warmth of his temporary home. He stared into the flames, watching them flicker and twist, his mind replaying everything: the discovery, the search, the restoration, and now the unshakable certainty that he had done something that mattered. The grief was still there, buried deep, but it no longer consumed him. He thought of his father, of the stories he had told about the importance of remembering, of honoring what came before so the future could be stronger. Jonah had never truly understood that lesson until now. The sentinel had been forgotten, buried beneath time and indifference, but it had still waited. And in finding it, in piecing it back together, Jonah had found something of himself too. The puppies stirred, tiny paws stretching, soft whimpers filling the room. Jonah smiled, reaching over to stroke their fur, warmth spreading through his chest. "I think I'll keep you," he murmured, and Freya thumped her tail against the floor as if she had already known the answer. Outside, the wind rustled through the redwoods, whispering through the leaves, carrying the echoes of a guardian once lost, now remembered. Jonah closed his eyes, listening. For the first time in a long while, he felt whole,